Empathic Understanding of Trauma in the ELA Classroom. So before we begin my presentation, I want to take a moment to reflect on the term trauma itself. This is a word that I think most of us are familiar with and could probably vaguely define. But for people who have experienced trauma, whose loved ones have experienced trauma, and for educators who are working with students who are experiencing or are survivors of trauma, it's imperative that we have a more clear definition, not only to better understand what trauma is, but so that we can begin to understand its implications and how to work with students who have survived trauma. So according to the American Psychological Association, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, which can include things like depression and anxiety, flashbacks, strained relationships, and often physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. There's no one right way or one universal way to respond to a traumatic event. Fear, anxiety, anger, sadness, guilt, and numbness are all common trauma symptoms. Traumatic events can be personal in the forms of abuse, loss. They can also be collective in the forms of war, witnessing large-scale acts of violence, natural disasters. Trauma can also be intergenerational, cultural, and historical. So, for example, the experience of Native Americans and the displacement that they've experienced, that trauma is passed down from generation to generation. Today, 70% of all adults have experienced at least one traumatic experience in their life, 20% of them developing post-traumatic stress disorder, which affects about 8 million people every year. So even though trauma is something that in polite conversation, I would say we tend to avoid, it is definitely something that we're all carrying around with us, inside of us, in some form or another. It's not that it's rare. The extraordinary thing about trauma is, in fact, how common it is. A 2017 study found that 47% of all U.S. students experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, with 35% experiencing it by the time they entered kindergarten, and 22% experiencing 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. So the students that are walking through our doors every day are carrying within them scars of these traumas that I think we as educators are only barely seeing the very tippy top of the iceberg of. Research shows that having 2 or more adverse childhood experiences can be detrimental to childhood development and health and impact academic success. And the study, to point out, was conducted well before the pandemic. So if we were to look at this figure today, I would suspect that it's going to be significantly higher. So in the educational setting, there's a greater awareness about trauma in recent years. So trauma-informed care or trauma-informed education, those are buzzwords that we often hear. However, I would argue that educators receive few actual tools that can be used to teach, connect with, or help students who have experienced or are survivors of trauma. So this project is an attempt to fill that gap. So 2 guiding questions that led me on my path of inquiry. How can ELA disciplinary literacies be used to develop greater awareness, understanding, and empathic responses to trauma among middle and high school students? And how can ELA disciplinary literacies be used to connect with and help students who have experienced trauma? So the thesis of my project is that verse novels written about the author's personal trauma in conjunction with teaching students about trauma itself can be used as a vehicle to develop empathic understanding of trauma in the ELA classroom. So quickly to discuss the format, why books in verse? So verse novels, as are often referred to as books in verse, are novel-length stories written in the form of poetry. And one reason why this format is so effective is that poems can tell important stories. There's a dual nature of poetry. It can be both effective and effective. So beautiful as a language, but also do something important in the world. And poems can also pack an emotional punch that can effectively deal with a myriad of emotions, including pain, hurt, shame, love, and joy. And novels in verse fit the messiness of trauma. So free-form poetry releases the writer from having to follow a chronological narrative. Stories instead could be told in a series of snapshots. And later on, I'm going to review a research article that talks about kind of the science of trauma and how that trauma is stored. And when I learned about that, this part just made so much more sense. The author then, in writing it in this free-form format, can focus on what is necessary to tell their truth and leave the reader to fill in the rest. So here's an example of a poem read by Lori Halls Anderson from her memoir in verse, Shout, about the sexual assault she experienced as a 13-year-old girl.
This is called #MeToo. Me, too weak to fight him off. Me, too scared, silent. Me too, disassembled by the guy who misunderstood, mistaken, mention my name to my misery siblings as we support, report, reveal the violence they desperately want us to conceal. Me to be stronger, you to stand taller, we to shout louder than they thought we could. This is called #.
So before I talk about how disciplinary literacy can be used to develop understanding of trauma, it's important to take a moment to talk about just what is disciplinary literacy. So all of us are aware that as students transition from elementary to middle and high school, they switch from learning to read to using reading as a tool for learning. And so additional literacy support is needed at this age level because the reading demands are so much greater. So in middle and high school, students must incorporate discipline-specific background knowledge and skills in each subject area, all of which require a specific type of reading. So the reading that students are being asked to do, say, in U.S. history class is going to be quite different from the reading they're being asked to do in geometry or biology. Students should be immersed in the discipline and utilize skills, strategies, and practices by experts in each field. The ultimate goal is to improve reading and writing skills and to engage in a disciplinary culture. So in the ELA classroom, that disciplinary culture would be the culture of readers and writers. Critics claim that struggling readers should master generalized reading skills first, but proponents counter that all students are capable of learning and can benefit from discipline-specific strategies. So in this article, in the content area reading and disciplinary literacy, a case for the radical center, Lee and Sprightly state that educators should collaborate to forge a middle ground that creates opportunities for students to learn reading strategies while engaging in discipline-specific classroom activities. This can be accomplished through literacy-rich routines that guide and support students before, during, and after their reading. And in the ELA classroom, that includes activating and building background knowledge, just like other content areas, understanding rhetorical tools used by authors, such as symbolism and irony, being able to make intertextual links, and having the ability to understand the human experience and dilemmas from time periods from the historical past. One way to do this is through film. Another way to do this, though, is by better understanding human experience and dilemmas from the present, because, as you all know, many of those human experiences and dilemmas are quite universal. And so reading about and understanding trauma is one way to do this. So how can ELA disciplinary literacies be used for trauma-informed practice? So, thinking about books as windows and mirrors. So as windows, reading about trauma can foster a deeper sense of understanding and empathy by helping students recognize and make sense of the pain in the lives of others and possibly even their peers. And then as mirrors, verse novels can serve as a lifeline for anyone who has survived trauma or is currently living in a traumatic situation. When writers try to make sense of the incomprehensible by putting their trauma into words, readers who recognize parts of themselves in the story are reassured that they are not alone. So what follows is a review of the literature that I found during the research on this topic. The first article I would like to highlight is The Impossibility of Witnessing and the Imperative to Listen, Teaching Trauma in an Interdisciplinary Classroom. The author of this article is a professor of literature, but also a practicing clinical psychologist. And so she offered, I thought, a very unique perspective about teaching trauma in the classroom. Her setting was the college setting. It was an undergraduate course, but I think a lot of this could be applied in a high school setting as well. Her claim is that literary texts and clinical practices can inform one another in order for students to better understand the lived experience of others and the meaning of trauma. So, implications for the classroom, she states that when teaching about trauma, it's important to emphasize the need for students to be witnesses of trauma, practice genuine listening, and to be able to tolerate ambiguity and the messiness and the uncomfortableness of learning about and trying to understand trauma. Oftentimes, there is no happily ever after, and students need to learn that it's okay to tolerate that ambiguity. She uses students' own personal experiences as a tool to help them learn how to listen beyond the content of their own experiences, and really stresses that it's impossible to understand another's trauma, but we can learn to listen without judgment and without bringing our own assumptions. And so, by listening without trying to fix or without trying to make the story about themselves, it's a really important tool to practice and learn. And she states the most fundamental responsibility we have to one another as humans is genuine listening. And I think if students are able to practice this, going into a verse novel, they would be much more willing to read that story about the author's lived experience, again, without that judgment, without bringing their own assumptions, and just really being there as a witness of that trauma. The next article I'd like to highlight is Shelling Beans, the use of sociocultural poetry to assist pre-service teachers and counselors develop empathic understanding of cultural differences. So Ingman's claim is that poetry can serve as a vehicle for therapeutic self-reflection and exploration. And again, highlights the dual nature of poetry and that it's significant for both the reader and the writer. And that as readers interact with the text, they're interacting with the author's lived experience. The author defines sociocultural poetry as writings that address the social, cultural, and racial experiences of members of oppressed groups. And even though, the purpose is to better understand people whose lives are different from their own, I would emphasize that trauma could be a part of that experience. And that sociocultural poetry or poetry about trauma can also help students to develop that greater empathic understanding. The author talks about how through poetry he was able to find his voice that allowed him to critically challenge the documented historical, racial, and cultural stereotypes that exist about people of color. And the goal of this is to create a framework of respect, understanding, and to explore the lived experiences of others. And so, again, he uses sociocultural poetry to do this, but in conjunction with a counselor empathy model. So the practice is as follows. First, a poem is read that relates to a person's lived sociocultural experience. And then there are six stages to critically analyze that poem. So the first is to acknowledge the reader's effort to understand the character's lived experience. So kind of patting the reader, patting oneself on the back for making the effort. The second step is to investigate how the poet directly stated their feelings or thoughts in relation to race, gender, and ethnicity. So kind of that literal level meaning what's directly said. The third step is to investigate how the poet used nonverbal cues to express feelings or thoughts. So this may include things like metaphor and imagery, mood. The fourth step is to ask, how do I, the reader, feel after having read this poem? So, as important with any type of literature, being able to articulate kind of that gut feeling that the piece evokes is a really important aspect of analyzing that piece. Step 5 is to put yourself in the character's lived experience. How would I feel if this happened to me? He stresses this is not the time to be sympathetic or to feel guilty, but to truly try to practice empathy and put yourself in that character's experience. And then the last step, I think is an important one, is to acknowledge and validate the feelings, thoughts, and nonverbal cues that have been expressed by the poem's authors. The next article I'd like to review is Deepening Students' Reading, Responding, and Reflecting on Multicultural Literature. It all started with Brown Girl Dreaming. So the authors of this journal article, their claims are that all students deserve exposure to literature that is inclusive and representative of the real world, the world that students actually live in and see around them. However, exposure isn't enough. Educators need to bridge the gap between just reading about diverse literature and personally connecting to it. And when given multiple opportunities to engage with multicultural literature, there is the potential to develop students' understanding and foster empathy for their own and others' lived experiences. And again, the specific intent of this practice was to create greater multicultural understanding. Again, I would argue that trauma could be included as part of that lived experience of others, and that by reading and engaging it through this model, a greater understanding can be developed. And then the last claim that they make is that this process can broaden students' worldview by helping to break down stereotypes through critical questioning of the text and respectful listening of one another. So this is what this looks like in the classroom. The particular text that they focused on was Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. If you're not familiar with it, it is her memoir in verse. Jacqueline Woodson is an African-American writer and poet, and this is about her childhood, growing up in a family that has been separated, with her father living in the North and not seeing him very often, and living with her mother in the segregated South. So really tapping into a form of collective and historical trauma through living through the Jim Crow era of the South. The first step is students read and annotate the text. The authors stress that this is a routine that the students have learned prior to reading this, so this isn't something they're being taught as they're reading the text. The second step is imitation poetry. So students write a poem about a personal experience, but model it after a poem in the book through imitation of the author's structure, style, and craft. The third step is to engage in that read, talk, write, and that these activities of discussing a shared reading experience or a selective text or a selective passage of the text can help to create knowledge as students are putting their own thoughts into words about these selective passages through those structured opportunities for discussion. Step 4 is allusion, research, and writing. I think this in particular would work really well with verse novels written about the author's lived traumatic experiences. An allusion is a reference to another work or another person or event. And so students researched an allusion from the text and engaged in nonfiction writing about it. In this particular case, they created infographics to share the findings of their research. After creating the infographics, they then wrote an allusion-inspired poem to synthesize their learning in a very personal and creative way. So the allusion that they researched is what became then the subject of their poem. And many of the poems were very much inspired by the poetry in the book that they had read, as far as style and structure. The last step is a gallery walk to share the published works. So the poems and the infographics that they had created were on display, and other classrooms were invited to come in and view them. And then the last step is an important one, and that is reflective writing. And the authors, instead of doing kind of a generic reflection, had students create theses that kind of capture the learning that they've done, and then write about that thesis as a way to reflect on the learning process and how their thinking has been impacted. And this is a process that can be replicated with other verse novels about trauma. So these are the texts that I would recommend. I would recommend doing this in, a book club type format and not requiring students to read all of them. These do represent a wide variety of traumas and all aimed at the upper middle school and high school age level. They're all memoirs in verse and all include the author's lived traumatic experiences. The other thing that they all have in common is they feature the theme of art and literature as a way to cope and as a way to heal those traumas. All of them also end on a very hopeful note, not necessarily a happily ever after note, but does end on a note of hope, which I think is important for this age group. These are other texts that I would recommend that could also be used as vehicles for understanding and developing empathy towards trauma. Some of the books in verse I have here are written by own voice authors, but aren't necessarily autobiographical. The graphic novels presented here are autobiographical and do feature some form of personal or collective trauma experienced by the author. And then the books at the bottom, some of them are autobiographical, some are not, but these are written more, in a prose format. But I do think that representation is important. Having different groups represented, as well as having a variety of traumas represented. So these are other texts that could be incorporated as well. So the importance of writing about trauma. Dr. Edith Eger, who is a Holocaust survivor and today a prominent psychologist, writes in her book, The Choice, suffering is universal, but victimhood is optional. She herself spent time in Auschwitz, was forced to flee Hungary as the communist regime took over, emigrated to the United States, and her book is quite a fascinating one. It is a memoir, not a memoir in verse, but I do highly recommend it. And her journey of healing. She writes about how healing only comes from freeing oneself from shame and guilt and feelings that work to keep one trapped in the trauma unless they are released. And she believes that until you confront your own story, your story will own you. And writing is one tool that can do that, and it is one tool that we can do in the classroom setting. One text I would like to highlight is Roxane Gay's personal narrative essay, Writing into the Wound. And she writes about her own personal trauma that she experienced as a young girl, but also about her journey as a writer, writing about that and the trauma that she experienced upon publishing it. And she also discusses collective trauma and recent collective trauma that we as a nation have all faced, through the forms of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. So her claim is that writing about trauma is a craft and can be done well, and it should be done ethically. So in the classroom, she really stresses the importance of reading as writer and recommends the study of several texts because each author was able to take ugly experiences and make them beautiful, which I would argue she does also through her writing. She stresses the importance of writing ethically about trauma, so as not to re-traumatize the writer or the reader, that there should be a clear purpose for this. It shouldn't just be to write about something because it happened, but that the writer should look inward as well as outward and to make a connection between their own traumatic experiences and the world around them and their lived experience in it. And to do this, she advises her students to always leave space in their writing for the reader. And then the last piece I would like to highlight is a chapter from a book. The chapter is titled From Trauma to Writing. And the claim is that the same qualities that produce good writing also have healing benefits. And this article really looked deeply at the brain's research about trauma. And she explains that traumatic events are stored as images in the amygdala, which are non-cognitive, and we as individuals have a difficult time retrieving them. She writes that we sense painful memories even if we cannot verbalize them, which is perhaps why we tend to be drawn to our emotionally difficult experiences. We seek a way to make the unknown known. She writes that healing is more likely to occur when survivors can describe not just the events of their trauma, but the images that their memories have stored of the traumatic event. So in the classroom, she really makes clear that there is a fine line between therapy and writing instruction, and that teachers should exercise caution as we are not trained therapists. However, the processes used for writing and therapy can in fact inform each other. So when the writing connects the emotions with the images, healing occurs, and so does good writing. And she really focuses a lot on visualization activities that are effective. She begins by asking students to make lists of what they have seen in memorable places, places like their, grandma's living room, and make a list of all that they see in that setting. And then later she encourages students to use what she calls a film camera to go back to the moment and to capture everything that they're experiencing in that moment, the setting, and every detail that they can possibly imagine in that moment. Oftentimes, students need permission and the opportunity to access these images from their past, and recovering one's images is key to finding one's voice. And when a student is able to tap into their own voice, that's when powerful writing happens. As a classroom community, by being vulnerable, these shared stories of trauma have the power to unite the classroom in a sense of community, and students can then contribute to that shared experience of what it means to be human. And trauma, as I've already pointed out, is unfortunately an all too common part of that experience. So here is my suggested implementation for using these in the ELA classroom. I would begin by using Igman's model of sociocultural poetry to create a safe place and a framework of respect and understanding to explore the lived experiences of others. I would suggest spending time learning about trauma and how to be a witness to it by using personal experiences as a tool for practicing genuine listening. So that students are reading these verse novels about the author's lived experiences without judgment and without bringing their own assumptions, and really practicing that act of genuine listening so as that they can be witnesses to that trauma. I would recommend studying mentor texts such as Gay's Writing into the Wound to better understand the nature of trauma, but also to recognize the characteristics of well-written and ethical texts on the subject so that they can read with a critical eye as well. I would also employ the model. This was the article by Bedard and Fukrin about Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming, and to implement literacy-rich routines that create opportunities for students to read, respond, and reflect on trauma-based verse novels. And lastly, using therapy-informed practices and a writer's workshop model invite students to write a personal narrative poem or a short story in verse about a personal experience. And I'd like to end just with this poem. It's called Postlude My Why. This is also taken from Shout by Lori Halls Anderson. I'll allow you to just pause the video and you can read it on your own. And then here is my Works Cited page and the bibliography of the text that I highlight in my presentation. So thank you so much for listening. I apologize. I know it is a little bit long, but I do think that this is a really important topic, and this is a really important tool that we as educators could use, to better connect with our students who are survivors of trauma, to better understand, where they're coming from. And what they're bringing with them into our classroom, not just to connect with them, but also to help them improve as readers and writers, and to potentially even help them begin to heal through reading and writing in our classrooms. So thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions, please send me an email.